Welcome to the Voodoo Power Podcast.
Welcome to Plates and Pancakes. We're sitting down today with Derek Evely. Coach Evely has been coaching professionally for the past 30 years. He's gained expertise in high performance and youth development training systems and methodologies. Coach Evely has worked at every segment of development continuum for young children to elite athletics. He has lectured and consulted globally, assessed professional and grassroots coaching for federations, and created athlete development models for various national federations. Currently, his focus is on developing e-learning opportunities for coaches, teachers, sports trainers, and parents. Through his coaching career, Coach Evely has been named to 4 World Championship teams, 2 Olympic teams, the European Championships, the European Team Championships, and European Under-23 Championships, as well as many more. So thanks for taking some time, Coach.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Stephen. As I said off there, Peter Royal speaks highly of you, so he thought we'd have a good conversation. So I have no clue what we're going to talk about, but I have a few good ideas, so I'm looking forward to it. You're in Missouri, right?
Yes, I am.
Whereabouts in Missouri?
I am just south of Kansas City, about an hour.
Oh, okay. It's a little bit further away than where I'm going to be. I'm going to be in Missouri. I sell these tarps, these throwing tarps, which are, kind of doing quite well, actually. Wow. I'm getting more business than I thought I ever would on it. And my first prototype was at University of Missouri. Robert Weir is an old friend of mine, and Brett Halter, and so I put one in there. It was the first big one I did, and so anyways, I'm going down there in a couple of weeks to they're moving their tarp, and I'm going to do some maintenance on it and stuff like that. So maybe we can hook up.
Well, yeah, let me know. I know me and my wife have been talking about going to Colorado. We'll see how it falls, but Columbia is not terribly far away, and I always enjoy the campus.
Cool. Nice.
So you were talking about Pete. Pete's the one that kind of got me turned on to your stuff. He's a great guy. We've got to be friends through Instagram and then a podcast. I was in Chicago a while back and got to meet up with him, and just a super great guy. But he spoke highly of you and your methods and the Bondarchuk system. What led you to the Bondarchuk system as opposed to another system that could have worked possibly?
Well, if you're a throws coach and you're serious about it, back when I was coming up, pre-internet, then there's one name that always kind of jumps out when you're talking about like the theory and methodology of training, everything to do with the hammer throw, and a lot to do with the other throwing events as well. And that's Anatoly Bondarchuk. And, long before I ever met him, before he ever came to Canada, because he came to Canada and he moved into my basement. We brought him over and hired him. It's a long story, but essentially his family contacted myself and the leadership in the small club I was working at in Kamloops, British Columbia, Canada. I'm moving back to Canada in a couple months to Vancouver, but this Kamloops is about 4 hours northeast of Vancouver. And but before I ever met him, I studied all of his stuff, and I actually had a little Bondarchuk file, a little book where I printed everything off and bound it together and all of that, because I had a keen interest in periodization, theory, and methodology, and that. And then out of the blue, one day we get this message saying, "Hey, would you like to hire my father-in-law?" And it was his son-in-law that contacted me. He had been in Kuwait for 10 years since leaving the Soviet. Once the wall fell, once the Eastern Bloc kind of crumbled, then he went to Kuwait, was there for 10 years, and wanted to leave because he's getting on and it's getting a bit hot. And so, and his daughter and son-in-law lived in Calgary. Long story short, it took a few years because there's a bunch of hiccups to that journey, and he he moved into my basement in April of 2005, and him and I started writing a book together, and that book, which was never published, is it was a skeleton for the online course that I do, because a few years after he moved there, I left after a year. I went on to other jobs, and in Edmonton and Britain and China and all these different places. And he and it yeah, so that became the skeleton for the course. I started getting a lot of people contacting me, asking me questions about it, blah blah blah, and I got just honestly just tired of it. So I'm just going to put a course together. So I put a course together online, and I split everything with him, and yeah, it's worked out really well. I've had about 400 people take it, so probably more than that now. But yeah, so it's been really good.
And speaking about the course, it's a very comprehensive course. I know through a scheduling conflict we had, I was able to get time to go through it. And Friday, I did a little bit in the afternoon. And then yesterday, I was doing some work. I put in some earpods and listened to it. So obviously, I wasn't as attentive as I should have been, but the information is still really, really intriguing. So,
yeah, I appreciate that. I think how many videos is? I think there's like 61 videos. It's been up for 6 or 7 years now. Actually, it might be 7 or 8 years. And yeah, there's over 60 videos in it. I go through everything. I mean, I break everything down. The course is designed for people from any sport. But if you're a throws coach, let's say, there's certain parts of it that are really going to apply to you, and if you're, depending on what your situation is. But essentially, it's there and can be used for anybody in any sport. So
the one thing I got, no problem, man. It was really good. The one thing I did get kind of listening to it and listening to some of the other things that you've talked about on different shows is, even as well as you've known Bondarchuk and way deep in the system, you've managed to make this somewhat your own, because I know you guys probably don't agree 100%, or you've gotten a little bit different results. So taking a system and kind of, especially one as good as what he has, and kind of making it your own, how long of a process has that been?
That's a really good question. Nobody's ever asked me that. It's ongoing. Like, it's ongoing, but there was a period there. I'm always I'm always reconsidering that, the fact that, maybe I see things a little bit differently. I have my own biases, being North American. It's actually also interesting now. I've been living in the US for the last 5 years. So there's a big influence there. You know what that is. And, I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I always find, and I found this a number of times, where, especially putting together the course, I had to go through all of it with a fine-tooth comb. It took me a year and a half to put that course together, of like every day. Like, it's comprehensive. And there were some parts where, I was like, God, man, it just can't be right. Like, this can't be right. And then every time I think that, and I talk to him, and communicating with him is a challenge. It always has been, because he doesn't speak perfect English, to say the least. But it's more than that. And it's the way he thinks. It's the way he thinks, the way he writes. I've talked to translators of his books. I just talked to his daughter not long ago. She was saying the same thing, because she'll do some translating. And she said, everybody says the same thing that translates for him. It's like, it's the way he thinks and the way he writes makes it difficult to transfer from Russian to English. So it's always a bit of a challenge. But every time I think that there's something wrong, or I have it's sooner or later down the road, within about 4 to 6 months, I realized he was right. It just took me a while I got to play with it, or it's got to sit with me, and then I will, delve more into that one aspect of the system, or employ it in my own coaching. Then there we go. Oh, that's what he meant. You know what I mean? And so it's a very, and that was what the book was like writing. It was painstaking. It was really hard, because we started literally the second day he moved in with me, the next morning. And this is all driven by him, not me. And I just felt it was, it was just so hard to get a paragraph even written. We were lucky to get, I'm not exaggerating here or embellishing anything. We were lucky to get a paragraph a day done because he would write all night the night before in Russian, transfer it into English, word for word with a Russian English dictionary. And anybody who knows Russian and English, I would assume, knows how problematic that can be. Probably any language, I'm sure, if you're to do it that way, but especially Russia. I found opposites get screwed around a lot. Like there's a lot, that's always been a thing. Um, and yeah, it was just really, really painstaking. But we never published a book because we never quite finished it. We kind of got fed up with going through that process because it was such a struggle. But I put that thing on a shelf. It sat in my computer for like 7 or 8 years. And then down the road later, Martin Bingisser was asking me about it. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll just give you a copy of it. Like, I'll just send it to you. And when I did that, I started reading it again. I was like, this is really good. Like, this is better than any of his translations. It's simple because obviously, but I found it to be a lot, I just thought, after not looking at it a long time, when I went back to actually read it, I was like, wow. And I also did most of the charts for his first few books I wrote. He would write it out in hand and I did it. And I was able to kind of reverse engineer a lot of it using the charts. And that really helped. So it was, yeah. So, but that at the time, that process seemed quite arduous and it was really difficult. But I'm glad we did it. I'm glad we did it because I think it gave me a better understanding of it than if I had have read all his translations 100 times over. And first of all, you can't understand how to do the system in its entirety by reading what he's written because he's never written that part. He just doesn't think that way. He's never written the book that says, well, here's how you start doing it. And this is what you do. And you have to kind of be there for that or experience it. And so, and in the course, that's the element I've added. It's like, okay, here's how you're going to do it from start to finish. And this is, these are the things you're going to run into and all that. Everything he's written is just not just, but it's the theory behind it. He hasn't written the practical how-to manual of it. So there you go.
Listening to you talk about that, I was taking some notes on it. So I know I talk about it a lot on the show, and guys that don't have anything to do with it get tired of it. But I was fortunate through my career. I got to work with Ray Hunt just a little bit. I got to work with Peter Campbell quite a bit, and then Buck Brannaman, all big horse guys. And to listen to you talk, horse,
horse trainers,
yeah,
like equestrian and horse racing and stuff like that.
Not necessarily racing, but they did work with race horses. But yeah, equestrians. I mean, they're some of the top hands that ever lived. Tom Dorrance, especially. But what you said really rings true to me because you watch those guys and the way they think and the thought process and what they see. You can't write that down. It happens right when it happens. And so not that I can relate totally to what you're saying, but yes, I can relate when you're around like somebody that thinks at a whole different level. Everything gets more complicated in some ways because the communication breaks down because you can't always explain what you're thinking. So yeah. I would imagine you had a lot of, I would imagine you had a lot of filling in that you had to do. And then he had to guide you to some sort of idea if that's what he meant or not.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And I basically just had to experiment with it, talk to, remember a lot of what I saw when I was there with them. And of course, after I left, I'd be running into him all the time. And I talked to Dylan, who was like this top athlete there, who was a former athlete of mine. I coached Dylan. This is Dylan Armstrong. He was Olympic gold medalist in 2008 in the shot. Current Canadian record holder in the shot. Well, he's now a coach, but even before he became a coach, when he was an athlete, I would ask Dylan, or I would talk to some of the other athletes. I coached a few girls that Bonner Truck coach, women, sorry. And they, so I was, you get little snippets of information here and there, but that's misleading. And there have been a lot of athletes that have, gone up to Kamloops, spent some time there, gone away and coach Bondarchuk, quote unquote, or whatever it is. And I find it's good to talk to people that have gone through the system or have experienced it, because they definitely have an insight to it. But the other thing is that this is not the type of system. It's not like and I don't say this negatively, I just don't have another word. It's not a formatted system, or it's not a recipe system. It's a set of principles. And there's so much nuance and variation to it, and it's so individualized that you really he'll do something with one athlete that he's never done before, will never do it again, but he doesn't tell anybody that, just because he just doesn't, he doesn't, just because of communication issues. Not that they're that bad. His English is quite good now, or it's passable anyways. But I remember distinctly that first year he was there, he would come up with a program for an athlete, and we'd be sitting there, and he would introduce it to the athletes, started on, say, their first day, and he would be doing something. I remember looking at him and go, well, how'd you pick that? Why did you pick that? He goes, oh, well, I'm just experimenting. Because I'm just throwing it against the wall. See, he didn't say this, but this is essentially what he said. He said, yeah, I'm just throwing it against the wall to see if it sticks. If it sticks, then that's, that goes into the toolbox, right? Or that he makes a mental note of it. And so, and I've seen him do some crazy shit. So if you were to go up there, Martin Bingetzer told me he made him do the same program over 100 times in a row once. The same workout 100 times. It says a lot about Martin, because only certain people would be able to do that. That, how long that takes? That takes forever. He's just doing the same thing. And that's just Bondarchuk. He just wanted to see how far he could take it, and what the athlete's reaction would be. Seriously. And, so he's, he used to say to me all the time, he goes, Derek, I not coach. He goes, I scientist, and what he's saying is that, everything's an experiment to him. And so, so when you're talking to athletes, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. And so so I was really fortunate to have that 6 or 8 months where we just hunkered down and wrote the book and all of that. And now, which is quite remarkable, is Dylan's coaching now. And he's coaching a young guy named Ethan Katzberg. And I don't know if you know who Ethan Katzberg is. Ethan Katzberg is probably, it's a really good time to be a throws coach right now, because there's some incredibly exciting things going on. There's Ryan Krauser, who I think is, if you ask me, is probably the best thing that's happened to the sport in a very long time. There's Alekna, who is incredible, incredible technical just everything about Alekna is phenomenal. I just love that kid. And there's Katzberg. And Katzberg, burst onto the scene a few years ago, and this year opened up with an 84-meter throw. It's the furthest throw, I think, since 2008. And he's probably in the first, he's probably in the top, he's got to be in the top 6 or 8 guys of all time, And so then Dylan coaches him, and it's, I've been talking to Dylan a lot, and it's quite amazing, because Dylan has this incredible feel for how to do this system. I was actually, I always, I've known Dylan since he's 14 years old. So, there's a certain amount of, me kind of probably looking down on him. I hate to say it, but there was anyways. But man, I am blown away by how well he has adopted that system, and it's particularly the way he applies it with Katzberg at the elite level, the nuance that Dylan understands and implements and works with the system with. Pardon my English there, but is truly amazing. Truly amazing. So I got him now to talk to, so I can call him up, and him and I have had some really interesting conversations. And in fact, I even went out of my way to take a young coach that I know from the NCAA, Brandon Amel. Him and I went up there a couple of weeks ago. We went up to Kamloops for a day and a half or so. We just squeezed it in after the NCAA champs and the personal trip I was making up to Vancouver, just so we could just sit down and have like a lunch with Dylan, and then we sat on Dr. B's porch and talked to him. It was a really nice trip. But anyway, so that's kind of, yeah, it's a very unique situation, and a very it's just very, I'm just feel really fortunate to be able to have been where I was at the time and be associated with him and learn from him.
Not to switch gears too much, but before we get too far into this thing, we had a conversation pre-show, and I was saying that, my goal was to always work with sprinters. I loved it. And I turn around one day and my gym's full of throwers. The high school level versus the elite level, you were kind of getting into that, and I'll just let you expand on that.
Yeah, well, I was saying, people, whenever I talk to coaches, like in this kind of context, someone I just meet and they're, I'm a high school coach, and they'll either say or they'll imply I'm just a high school coach. Well, look, man, I've coached at every level. I've done just about everything there is to do in the sport. I've lectured on elite methodology, developmental methodology, all of this. And I can tell you right now that coaching at the high school level, if you do it right, or if you want to do it right, is as hard or different than it is coaching at the elite level. The only difference is, and I think I said this before when we were talking, is that at the elite level, if you screw up, it's going to become apparent immediately. Like if you screw up, it's day of, week of, month of, year of, that's the nature of elite coaching. If you screw up developmentally, like if you screw up at the high school level, unless you really screwed up or you're really overloading and getting a lot of people hurt, you're not going to notice that. You may not notice that for 5, 6, 7 years down the road, right? And I've also lectured on this I think at the high school level we need to kind of reprioritize what success means. You know what I mean? Like for sure, results have always got to be number one, but beyond that, it should also be about whether your athletes are healthy. Okay, whether they're bulletproof to go on, especially here in the U.S., where everybody that has a modicum of talent is either going to go to the NCAA and compete, or gets looked at by the NCAA or some coach in it. And so you have a responsibility to make sure that those athletes go into those programs well prepared, but also trainable. Like, you don't want to hand off an athlete to an NCAA coach, having them tapped out because you've been pushing the maximal strength since they were 14, and then they're useless to these guys because they get there and there's not much they can do about it. And if just those two things alone, if you factor doing those in that way, makes it a lot harder. There's a way more nuance in the way you have to think about it. And I mean, I wouldn't say anybody, but it's not all that hard to get really good results with the right talent at the high school level, right? It's real. I mean, if you really don't give a shit about any of this stuff and you just want to maximize their potential as fast as possible in order to get a scholarship, That's not that hard to do. But to do that, to get them to a level where they can get recognized, to achieve the goals they want, but not send them there tapped out in their, in all their physical abilities, is really, that's an art form. That's not easy. And, whenever I hear that about people talking about high school coaching, and in the US, you even have another layer of complexity to it, because the push for big strength gains in high school is so huge. And of course, we all know where it comes from, right? It comes from the football programs, right? And they got big weight rooms, S&C coaches, and all this. And not that that's a bad thing; it's a good thing. But if it's not managed right, then you get these kids that go off to college, and that's it. They're done after that. They're either done when they get there, or they're done by the end of college. And if you look at throwing in an international context, throwers should be able to go on. I mean, the top throwers in the world compete well into their 30s. So how old is the average athlete done it at, when have they done their NCAA eligibility? Maybe 24? There should be another decade, assuming they are talented to go that far. There should be another decade. They should be able to continue. But if they're tapped out and you see it all the time, then, then that's a problem. And I'm not saying that you don't, there's some athletes who are never going to achieve. You just know from the get-go, they're not going to go past NCAA. Probably the bulk of athletes are not going to go past the NCAA. But that doesn't mean you just, you're just going to exploit everything as much as you can. You want them to get there and to have a successful NCAA career, not be hurt, be, and improve every year. And a lot don't. Some do, a lot don't.
Now, there were some other things I'd read, and this resonated with me because I've had luck with it with different athletes, but developing an annual plan for your athlete, taking the calendar, looking at it, working back, and not necessarily the days, but the exposures, count the exposures and see where you end up. How important is that, especially at maybe the high school level?
Well, if you're talking Bondarchuk style of periodization, right, or planning. So Bondarchuk's system has three kind of unique things to it, principles to it, right? Number one, and not that we're going to get that into it. I mean, maybe one day if you want. I mean, we could get into it. It's up to you. I don't know how far into the course you are, but there's three things to it. Number one is that we don't waive low volume and intensity. And that's the most bizarre one to most people, where we just repeat the same thing over and over and over again until they reach peak condition. And then you have to have a measurable, and you have to figure out how long that takes. And that's, there's a learning curve to that when you first start working with an athlete. But once you understand that, then all you need to do is figure out where you want them to peak, back it up, and start whatever program it is at that point and move forward. So in a nutshell, what that means is that our periodization is not based on the calendar. It's not like we're going to start here and we're going to end here, and we're going to, whatever period that is, let's say it's 3 months, it's a 3-month cycle, and we're going to manipulate everything we can in between as much as we can in order to force an adaptation, because we want you to peak at this date. That's not, we do the exact opposite. We first have to try it out, experiment, see where how long the reaction is and what type it is with an athlete. But we just, once it's the athlete's reaction to training is what dictates that time. Okay. And it's not even really time. It's like you said, it's the number of exposures to a certain stimulus, the stimulus being a program or 2 or 3 or however many. Okay. And talking about this, I mean, it's so easy to go down rabbit holes because every time I say one phrase, it's like I want to explain it. But and so once you understand that, then that periodization, that, for lack of a better term, because I really kind of hate that word, but that planning is completely individualized. Okay, so that's their natural reaction, and when they rise up and they come into peak condition, we never there's no tapering in this program. We don't cut anything down, and it's really funny because I was talking to Dylan, and I've experienced before, but I never coached anybody like Katzberg, as big a name as Katzberg, where you walk onto the track, everybody's like, "Oh my God, there he is," and everybody's paying attention to what he's doing. Typically nobody gives a shit about the guys that I'm coaching, what they're doing. But imagine you are on, you are in a holding camp, or you're in the, the Olympic Village or the World Championships Village, where everybody is housed, but during a games or a major championships. And everybody is using the same warm-up track and training facilities. Well, everybody that is there at that point is in some kind of a tapering process, right? Because that's the system, or that's the methodology they use. It's load, and then to some degree, and then prior to the championships, you unload, right? Well, we don't do that. The athlete has actually naturally adapted to the loads, and so Dylan has these funny stories where the day before qualifying, they're throwing, they're in the weight room, they're like they're going at it just like they would any other time during the year. And that's there, and everybody's like, what the fuck is going on? Like, what are they doing? So that's it's quite interesting. But that's when all of that is in the context of you don't wave load volume intensity. One of the other principles is that in order to drive adaptation, we use sets of exercise to do that. We don't drive adaptation by loading and unloading. It's very similar to what I just talked about, but it's a little different. So in other words, we are not loading, then unloading, then trying changing the intensity or the volumes in order to drive adaptation. Ours are to just stay steady because we do the same thing every day. In order to stimulate adaptation, we are choosing certain exercises or groups of exercises that stimulate the adaptation. And that, in some ways, makes it a lot more fun, a lot more interesting. In other ways, I mean, this goes right against traditional thinking, okay? Because traditional thinking, particularly in the throws, is squat, bench, clean. I mean, I remember when doing Olympics, doing cleans was like cutting edge. I'm going way back here, but you get what I'm saying. We don't do that at all. We don't look at exercises like that. We will have exercises or combinations of exercises that are our go-to exercises for a certain athlete, although that can come and go as well. But when we do a certain group of exercises in one cycle, the moment that they peak and they've adapted to that, we have to choose a whole other set of exercises. And by exercises, it means everything. It means the weights of the implements and all the actual exercises that we are prescribing. Does that make sense? So that's really different. So those three things, it's the not wave loading volume and intensity, using exercise prescription to drive adaptation, and the setting of our calendar, so to speak, or the scheduling of our planning of training is all highly individualized. It's all done by. It's just what we talked. What you said, right? It's like we don't go by the calendar necessarily. It's all about the number of exposures to training to a given set of exercises. So those three things are what make it super, super different.
Now, the one question I have, and I don't know if you're tracking bar speeds I heard you talk like you want to stay in that strength speed range. So I'm assuming 75 to 80% of a max. But my question is in that cycle that you're running, naturally, do you see the intensity creep up as they become coordinated in the movement? And then do you just let that happen? Or are you not watching bar speed and you're just trying to keep everything even?
Another really good question. Now, this is where this is where I've kind of added my own twist to it. And that's not to say that I do the system differently or I change it. I just monitor it a little bit differently than Dr. B. So when we start a program, so let's say it's a hammer thrower, athlete comes out to throw. Okay, so I'll be stepping into the situation en masse in a few months when I'm taking a new job up at the University of British Columbia. I'm working for an old friend of mine, a former athlete I coached named Laurier Primo. He's a brilliant head coach up there. He's done a really good job at the University of British Columbia. And I'm taking over for one of Canada's top throwing coaches, Garrett Collier, who coached Cameron Rogers. You know, Cameron Rogers, a defending world champion. So he's stepping away from his coaching responsibilities, a bit overloaded. He's got a family to look after. And so I'm going to be taking over his position there. And I'm going to be stepping into a group of athletes I know nothing about. I've never met any of them. I don't know them. Okay. So the first thing that I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to, and I'm using this as an example, whether it plays out exactly like this, so if any of those athletes are listening to this, don't freak out. Okay. I mean, we can discuss it, but, essentially, I'm walking in there. I don't know these athletes. I don't know anything about them. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to them, find out what they've done in the past, find out what exercises they're doing. I mean, Garrett will tell me that as well, but I'll have that talk with them. What have you done? And then what I'm going to do is then I'll prescribe a program for them, a new program to start when we start training. Okay. So that program, let's say it'll be one workout. And when I say if you hear me say program, session, workout, they're all the same thing. It's a workout. It's a training unit. And we tend to do only one in the circle throws, the heavy throws. Javelin, you need a few more because I won't get too into the nuance about that. But let's just say we know that in the heavy throws that we can do this. We can do the same thing every day with certain modifications up to 10 times a week, twice a day, even 5 days a week, or up to 10 times a week. Now, that's not absolutely necessary, and you'll under. There's hours of discussion on that topic in the course, but essentially, it's not whether you pick 1, 2, or 3 programs. It's really a matter of your situation, the event, the sport you're coaching. But we can get away with one. Most sports can't, but for argument's sake, we're going to use one as our example. So I'm going to present them with a program. It'll have what weights of throws for the hammer throws I want them to do. It'll have a special exercise. It'll have some weightlifting, that's short but sweet, and some general strength. Okay. And we're going to repeat that over and over and over again. Probably these athletes don't train once a day. When you're in university, it's impossible to do that. So they'll be doing it once a day, and they're just going to keep doing it. And I'm going to have to, and what we do is, because we're throwing, the program is the same. We do everything all together in every workout. That's called the complex method, right? By Dr. B's standards. So because we're doing that, we're repeating it, we're able to do it. And throwers are kind of unique in that if you can throw every day and you can measure your best distance every day, then every day you can get a perfect measure of form, because we know where they're at every day. It's on a scale. You just measure. You just pull up the tape and you measure it. So I track that every day, and that when you track it I'll do it 5 times a week, and then I plot it on Excel or something like that, and I create a graph. And if you've studied Bondarchuk before, you know that there's these 3 different reactions to training that happen. And those 3 reactions, that's what these curves are. Okay, they're the throwing distance. So one will go up to a peak, one will go down, then go up to a peak, and one will go horizontal, then down, then up to a peak. That's number 1, 2, and 3. And um, and so we track it. When they hit peak condition, then we know we have to make a decision whether we're going to maintain or start another program or go into a rest program. And there's reasons for doing any one of those 3 options. So when I was first doing it, now remember, I'm Canadian, right? So in fact, I have a business where I sell tarps so that throwers can throw into a tarp if they can't throw outside all year round. And I've invented this tarp that it's a special design with a special material that won't break down. It'll last the original tarp I ever did using this material is still in Kamloops, like 12 or 13 years later, and it's still going. I saw it a few weeks ago. So, sorry, didn't mean that. And that wasn't intended to be an advertisement. I'm sorry if it sounded like it. But, however, the point is that I can't always get a measurement every day, right? I can't because, when I was coaching there, I wasn't coaching in Ethan Katzberg or anybody. We had no money. We had no supports. We weren't going on training camps all the time. And, Warren, I wish we could have. I would have if we had the support, but we didn't. So, we're throwing outdoors as much as we can, but there's just some days we can't, or entire chunks of training when we can't. So if this system that we're working on is dependent, if your periodization is dependent on your results and tracking your results, what are you going to do if you can't get the results? It's going to be very hard, right? So I was coaching some women that used to work with Dr. B, and I had a farm in Kamloops and set up, we were throwing on the farm. And I noticed that just through whatever advertisement, I don't know, somebody, I think it might have been, I can't remember where it came to me, but I heard about the push, okay, the push band, right, which is defunct now, I guess, and output. I see you're wearing an output shirt. Output is sort of taken over, and there's a bunch of different companies. I use GymAware, Output, a bunch of different ones now. But I started thinking, well, we measure throws because, to get this daily measurable, our throwing weights, because of everything I've just said, our throwing weights don't change. We throw the same number of throws every day, same weights within a cycle. We measure it. Our barbell, whatever weights we're using in the weight room, are the same. We don't change it. We don't. So we, but you can't max test every day. You can't go in and say, okay, well, we're going to do this workout, but we're going to max test every day to see where you're at. That's not feasible. It's stupid, right? So I was thinking, well, what if we just slapped one of these things on, and then I could measure the bar speed, and the bar speed, the daily bar speed measurable I got, or whatever form that took. It could be an average of the top 3, whatever. I've tried a million different things, a million different measurements and configurations. I always come back to just the mean velocity, right? Usually, but there is some interesting stuff there that I've learned from a colleague of mine named Luis Mesquita in Portugal, who's really got me thinking differently about some of this stuff. But anyways, we can get back to that. And I started thinking, well, what if we just slap one of these things on a barbell and measure the speed of it, just like we do the distance? So the speed of the bar is equivalent to the distance of that's being thrown. And I'll just track that too. And let's just see what happens. So I did it. And I was shocked because the curves were identical, nearly identical, very close. And so I was thinking, the reason why I did it at the beginning was I was thinking, well, if there are days or periods where I can't get the measurable, how do I know they're in peak condition? Well, if I've already established that there's a correlation between the two curves, one is throwing distance and one is bar speed, then I can rely on the bar speed measurement to tell me approximately whether we're in peak condition or not, or whether we're in a ditch or whatever, right? So I just started, and it's super easy to do, right? It's super easy to do. And it's just another number I got to collect every day. It's not a big deal. So I started doing it. I've been doing that for the last 10 years. I have hundreds of graphs where I can show you, these things. So that's how I do it. But the beauty of it is, and this is where I think, for better or for worse, is where I differ a little bit with Dr. B. Dr. B is old school. He just guesses, right? Same with Dylan. They just guess. Now, I'm not saying that what I'm proposing here, what I'm doing is any better, because I certainly haven't done anything like with an athlete that Dylan's done with Gatsford. But I find it interesting. So what I do is I track this bar speed, and for me, what it does is it means like I can just prescribe the loads a little more accurately, right? Like, Dr. B will just pick a weight. He'll just gut choose a load. And I think, most of the time that will work for him. But for me, I've always been a bit of a strength guy, and it's just for me, I just need a little more assurance there. Okay. So what it allows me to do is it allows me to pick loads without having to do a 1RM to test. Okay. Right. So when I'm choosing the load at the beginning of a cycle, if it's a squat, then we just start loading the bar, and we just keep loading the bars from set to set and full intent. Everything is always full intent. Then I just keep loading it until we get to a speed that I think is appropriate. But rather than do what traditional bars, VBT is, where you are actually manipulating the weight every day so you can stay within a zone. I don't do that. We pick a load on day one that is just below the zone that I want to work. I want to target in that next cycle. And we leave it. And the athlete's job is to move the weight faster every rep, every set, every day. And over time, I want that speed to increase, just like I want throwing distance to increase. And if it doesn't, then I know I've done something wrong. Does that make sense? And I would say, and Dr. B is doing the exact same thing, except he's just not measuring it. He's not measuring the bar speed, and he's just choosing his loads based on his experience and his eyeballing, which is great. But what it's allowed me to do is it's allowed me to get a little bit more accurate with the loads. And not only that, but stay out of zones I don't want to be in, and stay in, and go through zones I do want to be in without having to 1RM. Okay. Or 3RM, I just never go to failure with anything anymore, ever. And I would say that the main difference between what Dylan and Dr. B are doing and what I do, again, I wouldn't even pretend to say that it's better, but I think it's just there's more application from what I'm doing to people that are outside of throwing, let's say, you know what I mean? And even within throwing, but is it enables me to stay, like I stay in the strength speed zone probably more than anywhere else. I will go the speed strength and strength speed zone. I rarely will go into maximal strength, although when, with that zone that we start at, when we start with that weight, it'll be a lot of times 0.5, 0.6 on a mean velocity over 4 or 5 reps, right? But they don't stay in that zone very long, because within about 4 or 5 workouts, they're already up to like 0.6, 0.7, and within by say 30 or 40 sessions into it, I had one girl start at 0.45, 0.50, and 2.5 months later was moving the exact same weight, the exact same load, the exact same reps, exact same scheme. If you walked in there, I say this all the time, if you walked in on day one and observed it, filmed it, made a video of this girl doing her squats, and then came back 2.5 or 50 sessions later and filmed it, you would see the identical thing. You'd see the same weight on the bar. Okay. Just the reason I'm so adamant about that is because every time I talk to people about that, they, later they go, "You mean you didn't change anything?" Yeah, no, we didn't change anything. And she in one cycle went from 0.45, 0.50 at the beginning over I think it was, 4 or 5 reps to over zero point 0.9. Think about that for a second. And remember, that's full intent. Okay. So you know what 0.4, 0.5 looks like, and you know what 0.9 looks like. I mean, those are two totally different things, but we're talking the same weight. Now, you cannot tell me that her 1 RM did not increase exponentially through that cycle. It had to have. There's no way that it couldn't have. And we didn't have to go into that zone or touch it at all.
Now, as you was explaining that, I was taking some notes on that, and then I think you answered it as you went through, so they were kind of negated. But what I kind of gathered from that was you might start them up on the strength speed side that might be a little bit heavier, knowing as this program develops, they're going to adapt and push past
Exactly. Glad you were listening. Because I've explained that to people before. They get, that's exactly it. So that choice of weight, the biggest decision when it comes to the loads is that first day. Like, I got to be like, that's the real. I got to be careful with that. Like, pick the load, and it's a bit of a guess too, because it's not like the numbers. I mean, I will look at the best rep in those sets. I will look at the mean or the average. All these devices give you all that, and I'll eyeball it. And quite frankly, a lot of times the actual decision whether it's 10 pounds this way or 10 pounds that way comes down to I'll change it to make it easier to change the fucking plates, because the body just doesn't not give a shit that much as I think a lot of people think. So if we're talking like, the athlete, like we're getting down to 0.4, 0.5, and they were using like 305, let's say, or let's say it's, 320. I'll just say, well, let's make it 315 because it's just easier. You only got to fuck with the 2.5 pound plate on each side, it's just 3 wheels on each side, and boom, go for it. Right. And I don't, I don't really care what the exact number is. And I say that kind of facetiously, but but I'm not too worried about the exact number. What I'm worried about is that it's appropriate and that they're going to be able to blast through that zone over the next 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks, whatever it is. And every time I explain this to people, they're like, well, doesn't that get monotonous? Like, don't you just know? It's the exact opposite, because workouts get super efficient. Nobody has to look at anything. Within 3 workouts, they've memorized the entire program. They come in, boom, 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 boom. They're gone. They're gone. And, cuts your workout time down by probably 20, 30% at least. And the first cycle you do with them. So when I go up to Canada and I work with this new bunch of athletes, the first cycle is going to be hell for everybody, because it's so much data collecting and it's all new to them. And some of them are going to go up and some of them are going to go down and then go up. And when they're going down, if they're not used to it, you got to kind of hold their hand a little bit through it, because they don't know, right? But once they do know and they're experienced with it, and they know when they're on their way up, they are incredibly motivated, because every day they get in there, okay, they want to move it faster. Just like every day when they get into the circle, they want to throw it further and further. They just want to move the weight faster and faster, rather than changing the weight every day so they stay at some certain speed. I'm not against that. It just doesn't fit into this system, right? And I mean, I don't know. I just can't. I mean, that whole that anecdote that I just gave to you with my girl Nia that was doing the squats and went up to 0.9 or whatever it was, or close to it. I think it was actually over 0.9. I mean, I cannot believe that wasn't, that was massive growth in almost every way that you can measure. Now, I should have won RM'd at the end of it just for the hell of it to see where it was, because shit, but and it's funny, no matter what exercise it is, no matter what the scheme is within reason, it always works out that way, which is the most bizarre thing. Like, when you think about it, like, you give an athlete a program and it takes them, say, 40 sessions to peak, and that, and you recorded it, and then you give them another program, and 40 sessions later they do it again, but it's a completely different set of exercises. It's kind of weird. I find that very fascinating from an adaptation standpoint. I just find it really interesting. And yeah, I'm amazing more people don't kind of grab onto that and kind of go, yeah, that's kind of cool, but some do.
I was talking to guys about that today, and the uniqueness of knowing that a kid's going to peak, an athlete's going to peak in a certain amount of sessions, and be within 2 or 3 sessions every time, no matter what,
Yeah.
Now,
well, go ahead.
But before we get too far off this, I have one more question, because you talked about it in there. As you change cycles, you'll see a small drop off, and then you'll see the athlete shoot up. And so as you finish one cycle, you have your washout, you go to your next cycle, you anticipate seeing a small decline, and then a peak. Now, if you would go to heavier weights, do you see that the decline may go down a little bit further than if you stayed at some lighter weights as far as percentages?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I'm not sure I followed you on the question there.
Yeah.
Actually, before you do it, can I just say one thing? I need to update that one part of the course, because, and like, the whole concept of a washout cycle, that is kind of my concept. That's my name to it. Putting a rest cycle in between these two different main cycles. You don't need to do that. I like to do it. And I like to do it because I found in the past that I got stronger reactions when I did that, or more accurate reactions. But I don't really do that much anymore. I just go right into the next PDSL, as does Dylan and Dr. B in that. That's kind of my thing. And I'm not sure how clear I made that in the course, but that's one thing. It's not, you can go right into another PDSF. You can go into maintenance, or you can do a washout and then do another one. It all depends on how much time you have and what is coming up. If you have enough time to do that, you may want to do that. If you don't, then you may need to go right into maintenance or something like that. And Dylan has done a brilliant job of taking that whole idea of going into a maintenance cycle, and it's just genius what he has done with that. It's not to get too into that, but go ahead and ask me your question again, and I'll answer.
And you won't be able to see it if you're listening to the podcast, but I drew it out a little bit so that maybe you get a I don't even, my light's probably too bright. Anyways, you have a cycle, you've programmed the cycle. Mm-hmm. You know that you're going to have a little bit of drop in form, mm-hmm. and then you're going to shoot up, and then you're either going to
after the cycle, when the cycle's over.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And so then
you stop doing that program.
Yes. And then you go to the next one. You're going to have a decrease in form, and you're going to take off again. Now, if you would program heavier weights like we were talking about earlier, will you see a larger decline in form before it takes back off than you would if you programmed a lighter set of weights?
You mean in the cycle that we did?
In the new cycle coming up?
That's a really good question. I would say, if they reach peak condition, it's not going to impact how long it takes them to lose form. What impacts them in terms of how long they're going to lose form, it's kind of a natural thing. Like athletes, so, and I don't want to get too off topic here, but Dr. B came up with all of this through studying loss of form. So he studied loss of form in athletes, Soviet athletes that had stopped training for whatever reason, like, a traditional transition cycle or whatever. And he studied, I think it was like 8,000 athletes or something. So he's got all this data. And he found what happened was all athletes drop off in different ways at different speeds. Everybody has like most of their drop off in the first 2 weeks. So, just as a practical aside, 2 weeks is the point of no return. If you have an injured athlete or something like that, I mean, from his studies, 2 weeks, you're basically starting all over again, or you've lost about 80% of your form, right? 80 to 90%. But not everybody. Some athletes will only lose a few, 5-6%. Some athletes lose 7-8%, and some will lose more than 10% after 2 weeks. And after a month, it's even more. But he found that some athletes, what we call the number threes, they have a very hard time losing form. They will keep their form for months and months on end. Like, it's not to say they're going to be able to come back in and win the Olympics without training for months on end, but they just don't lose a lot of form. They retain it more than other athletes. Okay. What makes a program work? And by that, I mean, what makes a certain set of exercises that you've chosen and you've prescribed, what makes it so that you're throwing further than ever at the end of that cycle is the quality of the program. And that's the types of exercises that you put in there and the types of loading. Now, density is something we really haven't talked too much about, but that's a huge factor here, because one of the things that you learn in this system when you do this system is that if an athlete doesn't change anything, okay, most athletes, if they don't change anything, they will come up to this peak. Okay, but if you continue with the program, they're all gonna drop off, right? The more you change the program within that cycle, the longer it takes them to reach peak condition. There's nothing wrong with changing exercises in the middle of a program. In fact, one of the methods Dr. B has is called the variation method, where every so often, in the example he uses in the course, you'll see it's every 2 weeks, but it really could be every few, whatever arbitrary timeline you're going to use to change those exercises. When you change it, every time you change it, you double the time it's going to take to reach peak condition, because you're starting with a new set of exercises. So that you're introducing something new, the body has to adapt to it, right? Does that make sense? But there is one really interesting exception to this. It's very notable. If you have an athlete that's a number 3, so that is the athlete that does not lose form very easily, they do not increase in form when you're changing things. That is the one group of athletes. If they're a number 3 and you're changing thing every 2 weeks, they're not going to improve. So you and I both have experienced this, and probably every single coach that's listening to this will have experienced times when they have prescribed a program to an athlete, and it just didn't go anywhere. Or they got to a point, no matter what you did, they're not improving. They're maintaining. I would bet that in a lot of cases where that happens, it's because you're changing everything. And that's one of the things that you learn in this system, where you would not learn this anywhere else. You couldn't learn it because every other methodology that's ever been done is based on change. You're constantly changing variables to manipulate adaptation. This one, you're not. You are, but you're doing it at the end of the cycle and changing again. Okay. So, and there's nothing, there are situations where you absolutely have to do that. That's why Dr. B has all these different methods. If you look at his books, especially the one on periodization, They're, I think, blue and green colored. The very first one, I think it's Periodization for All Sports, Volume 1. He has 16 different methods in it. So I wrote all those charts, okay, all those diagrams. Those are literally taken from the book he and I did. Those 16 different methods are all just different ways of handling this change of how you're going to change all these different sets of exercises. And we start the course off by talking about the exercise classifications, because that's the language that we use. And we don't need to get into that, but if you're interested in it, it's in the course. But it's so how you manipulate those different types of exercises: competitive exercise, specific development, special preparatory, and then general preparatory exercises. Like how you manipulate, you can't, I mean, you have to do that in some sports. You can't do the complex method in some sports. Like I always use this, what's extreme example, like ski jumping. A lot of winter sports, you can't do it because most of your training throughout the year, you don't have access to a ski hill or a bobsled run or whatever the hell it is, right? So, or a ski mountain. So, you're going to be, you have to do all this other stuff. And then you're going to get to a point where then you're going to go to wherever in Canada it would be Calgary, and then you're going to have a big block period somewhere, a phase or a stage where you're going to do all that specific stuff. That's reality. That's just your reality, right? Throwers don't have to do that because there's no reason for us to do that, because we can, for the most part, we can throw wherever we are all year round, or make some modifications to be able to do that. Does that make sense? So, it's so one of the things with the Bondarchuk system, a lot of the rumors and a lot of the way people look at it is they see throwers doing it 10 times a week and they think, oh, that's Bondarchuk. No, we're just compressing the density so we can get a peak as soon as possible. Because and I don't think any coach in the world is going to disagree with this. The more times you can peak, the faster you grow. Okay. The more often you can reach a peak condition, the faster you're going to grow. And that dictates everything that we do in this program. Everything Dylan does when he's thinking about Katzberg comes down to how many times can I get him to peak? Now, he's really lucky with Katzberg in a way, because Katzberg is unusually short in his peaking, which really helps, and that's why the guy is like burst onto the scene so fast, because he's doing this program by a guy who's a genius that knows how to do it and has Dr. B right in the same neighborhood he lives in, right? And so he's doing this thing. This guy's peaking like 15 times a year or something like this, and he's growing super fast. That'll slow down, of course, but still, that's the benefit to this program. I've had athletes that I've put on this system that have grown so fast. Not to get into this, but I'm afraid to tell people because I'm going to get accused of bad ethics. So, I had a girl, this one girl I was mentioning before, she grew 9 meters over the first 3 cycles I put her on. 3 PDSFs, we call it. I coached the girl way back in the day. The first athlete I really did this strong, and another guy at the same time when I was in Britain. And the periods that they were on this system, when I was coaching them there, they had by far the biggest growth in their career, because she improved 9 meters over 3 years. He improved 9.5 meters, I think it was. He improved almost 5. And so he was older, so you would expect, the growth to be not so big. But the girl I was also talking about earlier, Nia, the 9 meters, she's 26 years old when she grew, So that's the kind of growth that you can expect, especially early on when you don't wave load, volume, and intensity. But it's just hard for people to wrap their heads around. It's very hard.
as I was preparing for this, I was coming home from a clinic last week. So my wife drove, I was taking notes, listening to a podcast. And that's one of the things that hit me the hardest was I had one athlete in the gym that just, I couldn't figure out why he wasn't growing like the other athletes. And then once you said this, it dawned on me that maybe the change was too much for him and I should have kept him in a cycle twice as long as the other guys to see if that changed it for him. But I wouldn't have learned that had I not prepared for this, because I mean that really hit me. Like, that should seem like something to try, but I never tried it.
Yeah, let me I pulled up an old presentation here. Let me go through, just read out these three things so I talked about the principles, okay? So, and I just talked about this, but I think I probably wrote it down a little better here. So the first one, these are unique principles you'll find only used in modern system. Number one, the more peak conditions you have in a given period of time, the faster your overall growth. Okay. So, every time an athlete reaches peak condition, they grow in the broadest sense, become a better athlete. The result grows. Therefore, the more peak conditions in a given time frame, for example, an annual cycle or a career, the faster the growth. And this system is designed to maximize growth in the shortest period of time by targeting fewer exercises, but training them more often. That's increasing the density, right? Then the second one is, and these three I'm talking are just things that Bondarchuk talks about, and I experience, and Dylan and Bingisser and Nick Garcia, all these guys I know that do this and have really done it well. This is what they've all found too. That changing programs, that is exercises or training content, before an athlete has reached peak condition will extend the time it takes for that athlete to reach peak condition. So when you change things, okay, then you're actually, if you just change it randomly before they've reached peak condition, well, then you're actually, it's in a sense, it's kind of like starting over. Like they're going to reach, it's going to take them longer to reach peak condition. What is the one thing we're taught to do when we get into trouble? What's the one thing when things start going wrong? What's the one thing we all do? Change things, right? But it'll be interesting to hear your feedback once you've gone through the whole course, because you'll see there are two of these different reactions where they go into a ditch before they come up. So if they're in the ditch and you change things, you're keeping them in the ditch. And then you panic a little bit more. So you change it again, then they're back in the ditch. Then you panic a little bit more. You know what I mean? And I swear to God, that's just the situation a lot of people are in. They didn't stay the course long enough. And I get why they're doing it. I mean, I'm not saying that they should keep it, because, this is all within the context of the honor system, but you get the idea, you get the principle, right? Like we're taught that the moment someone, things aren't going right, we have to make a change. We have to input. We have to impact what's going on. And no, not always. Now, in the Bondarchuk system, we do as well. I mean, if you miss that change when they are in peak condition, you are fucked. Like you got to be on top of it. So it's not like we don't. I don't want to say that we never change. Change is the most important concept in this system, but it's a calculated, systematic change. That is not that other programs don't do that, but we change at a very specific time, and then we change, at least in the complex method, we change everything, and then we do it again. Right. Third thing, last one. And this is really interesting, but the more programs or content in an athlete's training regimen, the longer it will take to reach peak condition. That's why we, as much as possible, only go with one program with throwers. I probably didn't word that very well. Not so much as possible, but if I can get away with only doing one program, I'll do it. Sometimes I'll do two. I used to do three a lot, and I'll still do three. It kind of works like this. the more programs you have, the longer it's going to take for them to reach peak condition. Because if it takes an athlete 50 sessions to reach peak condition, that's 50 of each program. So if you have 3 programs, it's going to take 150 sessions, but that's a lot of time. But the trade-off is this: the strength of that program is going to be bigger when you have more programs because you have more input, but it's also way harder to control because you have so many more variables, right? So, like, when you do this system long enough and you start to realize that certain exercises, certain combinations of exercises, certain weights of implements impact a given athlete more than other ones. Okay. So throughout let's say we're training through a season and we're coming into a championships. Let's say it's let's say it's the Olympics in August or July. Well, throughout that whole year leading up to it, on average, I'll probably get 5 or 6 peak conditions with most athletes, depending on how many programs. Katzberg does, I think, oh my God, it's just insane how many he can get in. I think Dylan told me it's like 18 or something, or 20 or something like that in a year because he peaks in like 16 sessions. He can peak in 2 weeks. It's insane. Like, I've just never seen anything like that. Most of the athletes I've worked with are somewhere between 30 and 50, although I've had a couple that are below 30, but not much, right? So, if I lost my train of thought. I was talking about the 3 programs, right? Yeah. So 3. Oh yeah. So 3 programs is going to be 150 sessions. So there's nothing wrong with that, but when you're learning this, if you have, well, not so much when you're learning it, but if you have one program and they reach peak condition, you know exactly what worked in that cycle because you only have one program. It can only be a handful of things, right? So, that's that's super important, right? And the more exercises you have, the more noise you have that you have to filter out. So back to what I was saying. So as you go through the season, you're going to notice you're going to have certain cycles where the implements went really far. There was a huge amount of growth. They went really, really well, but you can't repeat the same program every cycle. You have to take these things out because if you keep doing it again, they adapt and they crash, right? They don't grow. So throughout the year, I will make notes of everything of what's working. And when I'm somewhere before I'm like 2 cycles out from whatever main competition we have, I'll have an idea. I'll have a very strong idea of what hammers are working that year for that athlete, what special exercises, what weight room exercises. General doesn't really factor in the general stuff. But anyways, and so what I'll do is before I write 2 cycles out for the main competition, I'll print all those programs off and I'll lay them on the floor and I'll look at them and I'll just stare at them and look at the content of each program, the reaction, and I'll look at all of it and I'll say, okay, well, what's popping out here at? Okay, so it could, maybe it's the 5 kilo hammer and a 3 kilo hammer if it's a woman, and maybe some sort of heavy turns. That every time I had that in, there was a lot of growth. It's a bit of a judgment call, but you got it. But you have a lot of data there to rely on, and whatever scheme in the weight room, whatever exercise and whatever loading pattern I had, that's going to factor in. And I'm going to say, okay, this group of exercises, this is the A plan. This is the money program. Well, I'm going to want the cycle leading into the major championships, but I can't put it in to the second cycle before the program because I have to have a new stimulus for that last program. So that's kind of how it works. Does that make sense? Right. And so I will do that, and then I'll pull it out. Now that can get tricky because not every athlete knows they're going to make that championships that early on. So what happens if you got to use the A plan just to get to the championships? Well, then it starts to get tricky, right? And that's where the nuance is in this system. And that's what Dylan is so good at with this, because he knows Casper so well, and he's been coaching him for 4 years, and he's so dialed in. It's quite impressive, I must say. And so that's kind of how it works. And I mean, I love it because there's all this different little nuance, and it's a completely different way of thinking, and it's fun. It really is. Like it's fun. And you, like, once you have the program set, you don't really do much. You just show up, you coach technique, and I record the data. And then as I know they're coming into peak condition, then I'll start thinking about what the next program's going to be. And within a week of when I think they're going to reach peak condition, I'll actually write out a program and start to tweak it in that last week. So when I'm sure they've hit peak condition, whatever sessions that is, because it repeats itself, it's fairly close to the same every time, then I have something ready to go. The next day we'll start the new program, or go into a washout cycle, or go into a meet.
Now, the one thing you said in there, and I've thought about it a lot, and maybe the more I coach, the more I take it into consideration, is there's almost like magic bullets in the training, and you want to use them at the appropriate time, and that gives you the boost. And if you use them,
exactly it.
Yeah, you hear guys talk about, well, quarter and half squats transfer over to the track better, so then they want a quarter and half squat all the time. Well, then what do you do when the quarter and half squat quits working and you're not transferring to the track now?
Exactly. And I get it. I mean, and that's the that's where the wisdom of this whole thing comes in. That's where you got to, it's that balancing act of prescribing the right magic bullets, but not using them all the time, not relying on them all the time, because then they become ineffective, right? So it's that balancing act of being able to do that, right? Like, and it's tricky. And so it even impacts everything I do in terms of, my facility, believe it or not. Like, I mean, if you go into my little container I have there where we throw, and look at our implements, I have a ton of implements. I have the widest range of implements possible, and I have a lot of hammers of each one, because I need the different weights to change. If you only have one, if you're a hammer coach and all you have is a 16-pound hammer for the men and a 4 kilo for the women, well, you're going to have a hard time doing this, aren't you? Right. And I think the one thing that most strength coaches, whether it's a throws coach, performance coach, SEC, whatever you want to call them, is that they get married to certain exercises, right? They get married to certain things. It's like, and there's nothing wrong with that if that works within your system, right? But that does not work within the system. Like, you have to be able to, you can't. The only thing I'm married to are the exercises that I know leading up to a championships are the bullets, are the magic bullets. That's all I'm married. I don't give a fuck what they actually are. All I care about is that they're there and I can recognize.
Now,
okay, and
that's kind of why Louis had so many bars that he used in his gym at Westside, was because you're always driving that adaptation. They figure out what bar would give them the biggest carryover, pull it out, don't use it till a meet, and then put that back in, whether that be a floor press or whatever. You're always looking for the one exercise that drives everything. That's what you use before you compete.
Do you know Mike Tashur?
The name sounds familiar, but I don't know him.
So he's big in the powerlifting world, and him and I, he's another super brilliant dude. This whole Bondarchuk thing has led me to some people that are just amazing. I have these great talks, and I'm having one right now. right? Where there was some of these guys that are like, for whatever reason, they take the course or they do dive into it and they just get like, they think that way. And so, and Mike is like one of the most successful powerlifting guys around. Like and him and I talked a lot about it. Now, in a sport like powerlifting, that's a challenge, right? Because, you're in terms of lifting, your lifting is your exercise, right? Like you don't, so finding like, remember at its most basic level, when you do these exercise changes, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to put something in front of the brain that it's going to recognize as different. And just because you and I wrote that down and said, oh, this will be different, doesn't mean the brain agreed with us. Do you see what I mean? Like, it doesn't mean that the brain, and I've told this story a few times, but, before I left Kamloops and moved to Chicago, I was coaching a master heptathlete, a really wonderful woman. And we were training on the track in Kamloops, indoor track. And we were doing long jump one day, and then the next day we were doing high jump. Dr. B was on the track both days, and on the second day he comes up to me and goes, Dad. He's all excited, right? Like he gets, he's such a fucking geek. Like when it comes to methodology, he's so excited about this. He's going, Dad, because he'd been thinking about this. And when I was up there a couple of weeks ago, this new book on all of this is coming out. But it's not going to get translated into English, unfortunately. And he comes to me and he says to me, he's going, oh, long jump, high jump, brain, like this. And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about, right? Because what I was doing with that woman is I had two programs. I had one program with long jump in it, one program with high jump in it. Okay. And I was tracking everything she was doing and trying to figure this out. And and then it took a while, but all of a sudden I kind of clicked into what he was saying. And what he was saying to me was, and I said to him, I go, look, I got to go over to your house. So I drove over to his place after work, and we sat down for like 45 minutes and we hashed this out. Like I meted more of this concept out of him. And what he was saying was this, and this is not in the course yet. I got to put it in. So you may not see this in the course. I don't think. I can't remember, to be honest with you. But anyways, it's that. Well, it is in the course, in the foundation of everything. But this specific example. So what he was saying was this: if the brain recognizes long jump and high jump differently, then I'm golden with my counting. But if it doesn't, the brain could think long jumping and high jumping are the same within some people, okay? Because it is the same in a lot of ways, right? I mean, it's a penultimate in a takeoff and blah, blah, blah. They are different, but he was just using it as an example. And then we started talking about implement weights, because that was my first question. When he brought this up, I was like, well, what about implement weights? Like, how do I know that the brain is recognizing a different implement weight from the one I had before in the cycle before, right? Just because, and I've always tried to keep a kilo difference between my implements from one cycle to the other, enough of a change that the brain recognizes it as different, but still still close enough to my competitive weight to be specific or have the positive effect I want. And that's not easy, right? Because you only have so many hammers. And when you're going from cycle to cycle, it takes a bit of thought, right? And so, but the idea is this. So anyways, sorry, let me back up to this story. So he's telling me this, and I had coached a woman named Sultana Purcell before him. And I had coached her for 2 years, and it was just the whole 2 years was quite successful, especially the first year, and training in the second year was hugely successful. Like, she was throwing distances I've only known of a few women anywhere that were hitting those distances. And then we had some issues with travel and that, and later in the second year, things kind of fell off. But before that, it was unbelievable. And but the one problem I had with her was that often she would peak way before I thought she would. Okay. Like I was expecting her to peak, say, in 60 sessions, 30 of let's, for example, 30 of program one, and 30 of program two. But she wouldn't. She would peak both programs at like 30 sessions. And I couldn't figure it out. Like I was able to make it work because I just go into a maintenance phase and just, but it always like I was always confused by it. I was like, what the hell? So when he tells me this, I go back, and I'm going back like, 5-6 years, and I dig up this data, and sure enough, what I saw was every time that, I mean, it didn't happen all the time with Sultana, but every time it did happen, I had her on 2 or 3 programs. And the problem with that was that the weights of the hammers I had were too close together. So even though when I was writing it, I wrote 2, let's say I wrote 2 programs. And in my mind, as I'm tracking her data and I'm counting this, I'm counting 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, right? And so if she was somewhere around just below 30 sessions, so let's call it 30 sessions. So with 2 programs, it would take 60 total sessions, right? That's what I had planned. But her brain in those situations was having none of that. Her brain was going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So when she got to 30, which was halfway through, 30 of 15 of each of these programs, she was peaked. But I was expecting it to make it to 60 or 30 of each program. Does that make sense? Right? And so I went back and I looked at it and went, sure enough, man, when you look at those hammers they were too close together. And so, and maybe the weight room exercises and all of that would have been different. I actually should go back and check the bar velocities too, but really all of us really cared about was the throwing distance, because that's what, that's our bread and butter. And so, I found that it was just, yeah, it all made, so that's one of those things where, it's just, it took me a while to sort of sort that out.
Yeah. And then you're making the program go faster because everything was too close together. And what it was, we used to, take softballs for my pitchers, my baseball pitchers. We'd take softballs and we put them on a scale and we drill them out until they weighed what a softball weighed, or weighed what a baseball weighed. And then we would just take different sizes, so we'd have a 10-inch softball,
Right.
11-inch softball. And then we would work through those and then keep them where they weren't always on a baseball. And man, we've seen some really good results doing that, which would be very similar to what you're saying. You just got to keep everything far enough apart that the growth is there. So the brain recognizes the change. Yeah.
And it can get even more complicated because you also add on to the top you also layer on top of it another principle that for me is important with throwing is that I've learned over the course of my career that you always need to have some kind of light and some kind of heavy implement in all the programs. In fact, I don't throw the competitive implement almost ever in workout. I'll do it before a big competition or a competition. And Dylan's come up with some really interesting ideas around that have really worked with Katzberg. It's pretty crazy. But, you layer that on top of it, and that restricts you even more because it's easy just to say, okay, well, I'm going to throw everything heavy this cycle and then everything light the next one. Well, that's a huge change. Yeah, but I found that if you stick to only heavy all the time, that impacts things. It impacts certain things really well, but it impacts certain things. I've always said that, well, you're a throws guy, so you'll understand this. But for me, and tell me if you agree with this, but I found that heavy implements get you where you want to go, and light implements tell you where you're at. So if you're throwing heavy implements will help grow form faster than light, I think, unless you have unless you haven't been throwing light for a long time, I guess. But heavy get you where you want to go, but light ones, when you can throw the light ones really, really well, at least the hammer specifically, and that gap between your competitive implement and the light implement grows is far apart, then you're in peak condition. You're in really good shape, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I see it. So you got all these things floating around in your head, you're trying to figure out, how to manipulate these, balance and juggle them, and yeah, it's not easy. I mean, it's funny. I got a couple of young guys right now, younger coaches that are trying this out, and the hardest part with that is getting them to buy into the concept. Once they do, I mean, it's always the same thing. Within a week or two, I'm getting these emails going, Jesus Christ, like, I cannot believe, like, it's just like PBs, like, and some of that is the system, and some of that is the fact that, they probably, if they've been doing the same thing year in, year out, then, you throw in this big systematic change, and that has an effect, and they're going to grow from that as well. I mean, even Dr. B says, I've heard him say this, he says, coach needs to change their methodology every 5 years, right? And what he meant by that is with an athlete, like, the one system will work, it will only work so long. Like you can actually adapt to the system itself as well. So you got that to think about. But in the biometric system, there's so much variation. We're changing things so much, like that it's, in terms of the content, that it's I haven't run up against that yet. And I mean, personally, I've moved around so much. I haven't had an athlete I've coached more than 4 or 5 years, well, more than 2 or 3 years lately. But but you get the point, right? Like you adapt to everything. They adapt to everything. They adapt to the the weekly micro layout. They adapt to the exercises. They adapt. The one thing that you really can't get away from more than anything is the intensity, right? Like, because the intensity in throwing and in most power speed sports is always kind of the same, right? Like, it's like the window that you have to work with in terms of intensification in the weight room is pretty narrow. Like, you can divide it down and say that there's, all these different levels to it, but really, what are you looking at? You're looking at somewhere between 1 to 6 reps, most, and if you're going above that, you're not going to go above that very long, right? Unless it's really light and you're moving it super, super fast. But then that's I don't think, to me, that's not enough load to stimulate adaptation in the long run, right? So if you're within that bandwidth, then what have you got to manipulate? If you're not, like, if you're not changing your exercises, if you're sticking to the same exercises all the time and you're limited by that narrow bandwidth of intensity, well, what have you got? You've got volume. So what are you going to do? You're going to load the fuck out of it, right? You're going to load, because it's the only thing you have left that's going to be able to stimulate adaptation. Because you're locked in with intensity and you're keeping the same exercises the same, what else is there, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but loading we all know can be an issue in and of itself. So,
well, holy crap. I mean, you said so much stuff in there that was just unbelievable. The one thing that caught me that I need to measure better is the gap between the heavy and the light. And then you can start seeing where they're peaking as that distance grows. And then when that distance stops growing. But you also talked about, throwing a lot of heavy implements. And let me ask you, because it's something I think I've stumbled on, but I don't know. If you keep them on heavy implements too long, does it seem like, I'm not going to say the intensity drops, but they get slower? And then now you have to do something to speed them back up?
Well, if they're throwing full intent, or close to it, then that shouldn't be the case. I think it's they don't get slower. I think neurologically, or however you want to look at it, you might have timing issues depending on how heavy it is. But that's why I say, you always got to have the lights in there as well. I'm not precious to either one. I just learned that if I leave any one of them out for any length of time, yes, that's exactly what I think happens, right? But when you say heavies, you mean all heavies or one heavy, right? Like, so for instance, like, if you only do heavies all the time, yeah, you're going to be in, like, you're going to pay for that, right? But you should always have a heavy, some kind of heavy, not always. I mean, there might be a cycle, a little small cycle. Like we have cycles where I'll go heavy and light, and then going into a competition, we'll go back to the competitive implement for 5 or 6 sessions, and then we'll hit the comp, and that works really well. But it's yeah, no, I don't think I think that's a real danger, and you have to be careful. That's why I always like to have all of them in there, right? Like, you know, um, if you, I talked to Dylan a lot about this and what he's done with cats. The thing with Catsburg, see, Dylan does a lot of that. We'll do that with Catsburg. They will only throw one hammer in a cycle, okay? But he's unique because he peaks so fast that within 2 weeks he's changing to another hammer anyway. So he's not going to get slow, but because he's not doing it for months on end. That one cycle, he may only have one hammer, whether it's heavy, light, or comp or whatever. But the guy peaks so fast that he just doesn't. There's no danger with that. That's the big advantage to coaching a guy like that peaks that fast. And I've also learned over the years that the better the athlete is, in general, this doesn't apply to everybody, but in general, the better the athlete is, the more sensitive their nervous system is, the faster they peak, right? But I think Justin Rohde, I talked to Justin Rohde about this, and the shot putter, he's in Ohio now, doing a really good job with a bunch of putters there. And he peaked very early too, but I haven't heard of anybody peaking as early as Casper. That's pretty insane. And when you got a guy like that, yeah, you can go one cycle of only heavies, because like I just said, in 2 weeks, you're going to be able to change it, go back to the next one. And if you fucked it up, well, you only fucked it up for 2 weeks, so you get another chance, right? Like, whereas you got an athlete that peaks in 50, well, that starts to get a little bit. You have to be a little more mindful, because if you didn't pick the right exercises or the right hammers or whatever, well, then you've just wasted 2.5 months or whatever it took to get through. However, whatever their density is, right? Like, you've just you get to the end of the cycle, there's no growth. I haven't had that happen very often, but if at all, that I can think about. But that like you don't want to get to the end of it and go, oh my God, they didn't grow. Well, that was a waste of time. So now we got to do something else, right? Like, but if it's 2 weeks, well, it's interesting. Yeah, it just, your frame of reference and your thinking is just different in this. It's just because it's so unique. I often say it's almost like an alternate reality, this system. Like, you can't put one toe in it. You kind of got to do it all, right? Like, although having said that, this whole idea, if I was a coach listening to this and I was not in a situation, or I didn't think I was in a situation where I could do bonder truck full on, the one piece of advice I would say is limit the amount of change that you're doing and get a daily measurable, whatever the hell it is. Bar speed, with bar velocity, it makes it pretty easy, right? A lot of sports, you can't get that specific measurable every day. You can't get it. Like, how the hell do you test soccer every day or hockey? You can't. You can't have a full-on hockey game every day. And even if you could, how are you going to measure it? Like, it's a judgment call, right? So yeah, okay, I get that, but you can do it with bar speed and other things that outside of it. Now they may not be the most specific measurables, but over time you got to test out different exercises, different tests, find out what actually correlates to that athlete improving in form, okay, i.e., becoming a better soccer player, a better hockey player, long term, short term. And then once you've established those, then you're going to use those to determine day to day, week to week, whether they're in form or not, or where they are in their reaction. That makes sense.
The one question I had on this is, when you program your lifts, we know that you're looking for speed strength. In your GPP and stuff that you're grabbing, do you pick up other parts of the strength velocity curve? So like through your jumps, are you looking at a ballistic ISOs trying to get absolute strength? Do you program in the whole curve in a cycle, or are you just looking at speed strength?
Yeah, you asked really good questions. Strength speed is where I am with the SPEs the most, the specific prepper, not so much speed strength. And that is, I mean, in the context of this discussion, that actually means something, because Bondarchuk, I would say, is probably lower on the force velocity curve than I am. Although I'm moving more towards that direction now, especially after talking to Dylan and that, but I'll only go so far down. If he listens to this, he'll be shaking his head. But he I just think it's, not all athletes can get away with not doing that intensification in some of those exercises. Although I'm not going to go heavy, like super heavy, and can't do it in this system. If I told you to squat 8 times a week, you'd think I was crazy, right? We can do it, right? But you're not doing anything else. Like, I'm not squatting and doing step ups and doing this and doing that. And no, it's the one exercise. And I've done it, and they grow like you wouldn't believe, but you do have to limit it, of course. It's one of the other things that you learn about this system is, this is not specific to this system, but most high end systems that are very successful, you'll see some version of this. And that is the idea of doing smaller bits more often, right? The big, arduous, heavy, and weight room workouts in our sport, I think, are kind of slowly getting put aside to more often, more explosive, more quality work, whether that's wherever it is on the force velocity curve. I mean, I tell you for sure, you could go down to like almost a 1 RM speed in a squat, and you could do it twice a day every day if you only did 1 or 2 sets of 1 rep. It would be interesting to try that and see what the hell happens. I mean, maybe it would work. I mean, that's way at the extreme, but theoretically, I mean, it's possible. I mean, right? A lot of people will say, yeah, I can only squat twice a week because if I do, there's just no way. It's not the squatting that's doing it. It's the squatting plus everything else if you look at some of everything else they're doing. Yeah. I mean, and that's not that's wrong. I'm just saying in our system, when you hear that we're squatting 8 or 10 times a week, just understand that we're doing it in a way that enables us to actually do that. We're lower on the force velocity curve. We're doing probably half the amount of volume in a given, probably less even. I can't really say, it's hard because I'm really not on top of what a lot of people are doing these days. But, the max I'll go is like 4 sets, maybe 5 sets. The first 2 to 3 you would call them almost warm-up sets, and we're not measuring them, and they're lower reps. But then each day, if an athlete is training once a day, doing the same, and I'm on one program, so they're doing the exact same thing every day once, they'll do 2 to 3 sets of whatever the money sets, right? And I'm measuring those. Those are the ones I'm recording and tracking.
Okay.
That
Yeah,
gives you some idea.
it does. And these are just different ideas that I've worked through. I'm starting to look at ground contact times, uh, to, to try to get around what you're saying. You can't squat guys heavy all the time. It's just not going to work. But if you know that long ground contact times in a jump theoretically could even a max squat, well, you can do the jumps and not show the fatigue. Well, you still hit the part of that curve. That's where the question kind of comes from. I just kind of seeing if I'm on the right track with that ideology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah. No, I hear you. Yeah, it's I mean, okay, let's well, I think I'm running out of juice here in my headphones, but um, you know, um, let me put it to you this way. Our workouts from start to finish, the entire workout, warm up, throwing, lifting, special exercises, general exercises, never take more than an hour and a half, hour and 15 to an hour and a half. If they're training, maybe if they're doing twice a day, right? Because I want them in and out, gone. And I've set up a facility where it's easy to do. You don't got to travel too far to the weight room. You only got to travel about 5 feet, and my container with the weight room's right there, right? If they're going twice, if they're going once a day, I might be a little bit more, but did that make sense? Yeah. So
Yeah.
okay. So, anyways, that's yeah.
Coach, I have 1,000 more questions I could ask you, but you've sat down with me for 2 hours. I know you're busy. In order to respect your time, one of these days we may have to do it again, but thank you so much for everything you laid out on this program.
Hey, no problem. Dude, I really enjoyed that. That was really good. Yeah. So it was nice to talk about some of these things without getting into I mean, a lot of times I get asked about this. It's about the mechanics of it so much, and which is good. But you asked some really interesting questions. I had to think, so it was good. I enjoyed it.
Well, I don't know if I'll be on vacation or not, but when you roll into Columbia, Missouri, shoot me a text. We'll see where I'm at, and I'd be more than happy to drive over there and have a lunch with you or whatever.
Will do. I think I'm in there somewhere in the end of July.
And we definitely, yeah, we could be back by then. And man, that'd be awesome because it's not that far away. So,
okay, cool.
Well,
all right.
Well, Coach, if there's anything I can do for you in the future or help you out in some way, I don't know what it would be. Just shoot me a text. I appreciate everything you've done for me.
Anytime. Keep up the good work. I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.